There is an old saying in the high prairie country, one that the almanac writers never thought to print, and the agricultural colleges never thought to teach. Still water teaches patience, and patience teaches everything else. Elspeth Vore heard it from her grandmother when she was 7 years old, crouching in rubber boots at the edge of a cattail bed while an autumn fog moved in low off the lake. She did not understand it then. She filed it away the way children file away things that feel important but have no use yet, the way you press a coin in your palm until the metal warms and then forget which pocket you put it in. She would not understand it fully for another 4 decades. But when she finally did, standing in mid-November sleet at the outer edge of 40 acres, the county had formally declared unproductive wetland nuisance property, watching 162 geese work the sedge in a slow, patient, methodical circuit. She thought of her grandmother's voice with a clarity that surprised her, and she did not cry, though she had expected to. She only nodded, pulled her collar up, and went back to counting. The 40 acres had been a problem on paper longer than Elspeth had farmed the surrounding land. It appeared on the County Drainage Authority's records as Plot 7-Marsh, a designation that meant, in the practical language of that office, that it drained poorly, that it harbored mosquitoes in summer and standing ice in spring, that the tiling necessary to convert it to row crop production would cost more than the land was worth, and that 3 successive drainage contractors had declined the job at any price. Her husband Wren had purchased the adjoining 300 acres in the 1980s, inheriting the marsh as an afterthought, a wet footnote at the eastern boundary of what was otherwise good enough ground. He died of a sudden coronary in the late autumn of a year, when the corn prices were low and the propane bill was high, and Elspeth was 54 years old and had never, not once in her adult life, been the one who wrote the checks. She had 2 sons. The older, Martin, worked in civil logistics in a city 4 hours away and called on Sundays with the careful, solicitous tone of a man who believed his mother's grief was a temporary weather system that would pass if he remained calm around it. The younger Denny was a decent person and a careless farmer who had already told her, with great gentleness, that he thought selling the whole operation was probably the right call and that there was no shame in it. She appreciated his gentleness. She did not take his advice. What she did instead was go through Wren's papers. This is not a romantic detail. She went through the papers because she needed to understand what she owned and what she owed, and she did it on the kitchen table in 2 sessions of approximately 4 hours each, with the relevant documents sorted into piles and a yellow legal pad on which she wrote numbers. She was not a dramatic woman. The numbers either worked or they did not, and she had learned from 30 years of watching Wren that the ones who panicked at the numbers were always the ones who stopped reading them. She kept reading. On the 3rd day of this accounting, in a manila folder labeled in Wren's handwriting, Marsh County Docks Tax, she found something that had nothing to do with taxes. It was a folded paper inside a smaller envelope, and on the outside of the envelope, in a different hand, older and more slanted, was written the single word, Geese. Inside was 7 pages in Wren's grandfather's handwriting, undated, but from the quality of the paper almost certainly from the 1930s. The old man, Arvid Vore, had kept geese, not 3 or 4 geese, hundreds of geese. He had run them on the marsh in a deliberate rotating pattern that he had worked out over a span of nearly 20 years, and he had written down what he observed with the care of a man who knew that someone eventually would need to know it. The language was plain to the point of austerity. He did not editorialize. He wrote what he saw. He noted which sections of the marsh recovered fastest after being heavily grazed and then rested. He noted the depth at which the roots of the sedge and the reed grass began to die back and give way to finer, lower-growing plants. He noted the behavior of the water table, season by season, as the plant composition shifted. He noted that in the sections the geese had worked hardest and rested longest. The ground in summer was firmer underfoot, that it held weight, that by the 8th year of the system he had walked across it without boots and felt nothing give. He had a name for what he was doing. He called it grazing the wet down to the dry. He wrote, "A marsh is not a problem. It is a process. Work with the process, and it will give you land. Work against it, and it will give you expense and grief. Elspeth read the 7 pages twice that evening. Then she went to the window and looked out at the dark where the marsh was, though she could not see it from the house. She made a note on her legal pad. It said, "Geese. How many? What kind? Who sells them?" She went to see Chester Haig the following week. Chester was the county's district land improvement officer, a position that sounded more important than it was, and that Chester wore with the dignity of a man who has never been given cause to doubt his own assessments. He was approximately 60 years old, thick-necked and pleasant, the sort of man who leaned back in his chair when he was about to explain something to you and who prefaced his explanations with the phrase, "Now I want to be straight with you." Elspeth had met him twice at county drainage meetings when Wren was alive. He had a round, intelligent face and a genuine willingness to help, which is to say he was the most dangerous kind of adversary because his condescension was entirely unconscious. She told him she was considering working the marsh with geese in a rotational pattern and asked whether the county's nuisance designation would create any legal obstacle. Chester leaned back in his chair. "Now I want to be straight with you," he said. "The marsh is the marsh. We have looked at that parcel 3 times in 12 years. The hydrology is not going to cooperate. You put geese on standing water, Mrs. Vore, you're going to have sick geese and a worse mess." He said it with warmth. He said it the way a kind uncle says something to a niece who has proposed a plan that cannot work. He said he would be glad to put her in touch with the state wetland conversion program, which offered a cost-share arrangement for tiling, and that he would make a call on her behalf if she liked. She thanked him. She said she would think about the tiling program. She drove home and spent the rest of the afternoon rereading Arvid's notes. In the spring of that year, she purchased 40 Toulouse geese and 60 Emden geese from a hatchery in the eastern part of the state, 100 birds in total at a price that was not small but was not ruinous. She built 3 portable shelters of her own construction, simple plywood and tin affairs on wooden skids that could be moved with the tractor. She divided the marsh into 8 sections using temporary electric fence, the posts driven into the soft ground with a handheld driver, the wire a single strand at the height she had determined from Arvid's notes would be respected by the adult birds. Section 1 was the highest and driest ground at the western edge of the marsh where the cattails gave way to sedge. She started the geese there in late April. Arvid's note said, "Begin where the ground is willing. Let the easy ground teach the birds their purpose before you ask them to work the harder sections." She went out every morning at 6 and walked the fence line. She counted the birds. She noted what was being eaten and what was being left. She carried a small notebook of her own and wrote down what she saw, dated, in the same plain style Arvid had used, without editorializing. She did not know if the system would work. She knew that Arvid had found that it worked over 20 years on the same land, on the same hydrology, and that this was a better foundation than the county's 3 contractor assessments, which were based on the cost of tiling rather than the behavior of water and roots and grazing animals across time. Still, water teaches patience, she thought on the mornings when nothing visible had changed, when the geese honked and the sedge looked exactly as it had the week before. And patience teaches everything else. Martin called on Sunday and she told him about the geese. He was quiet for a moment. "Mom," he said, "are there enough of them to make any real money?" She said she wasn't selling them. He said, "Then what are they for?" She said, "Land improvement." There was a longer silence. He said he would come out in July to look things over, by which he meant he would come out in July to reassess whether she was coping adequately. She said that would be fine. The neighbors talked, of course. There is no countryside so sparsely populated that it lacks for observers. Milo Satterley, who farmed the section to the north, stopped his truck at her lane one morning in May and watched her moving the fence posts and told her, not unkindly, that he had tried geese for grass control along his windbreak 20 years ago and that they were nothing but aggravation and mess. He shook his head with the slow horizontal certainty of a man whose conclusion has been formed and filed and is no longer open to revision. She said, "I imagine that depends on the situation." He nodded as though she had agreed with him and drove on. The woman from the county agricultural extension office came out in June, a young woman named Petra, sent because someone had evidently mentioned the geese situation to someone else who had mentioned it to the office. Petra was energetic and well-meaning, and carried a printed packet of materials about wetland management that she offered to Elspeth with both hands. Elspeth took it and set it on the porch rail. Petra explained that the county had a program, that there were resources available, that she understood this must be a very difficult time, and that no one expected her to manage all of this alone, and that there were options. Elspeth listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she asked Petra whether the Extension Office had any research on the historical use of waterfowl for wetland pasture conversion. Petra said she didn't think so, not specifically. Elspeth said, "I have some notes here that go back 90 years on this exact piece of ground. If you're interested in them, you're welcome to read them." Petra took the notes, read the first 2 pages standing on the porch, and then sat down in the porch chair and read the rest of them. When she was done, she said, "This is remarkable." Elspeth said, "It is a record." He was a careful man. Petra handed the notes back with the particular expression of someone who has just learned that they came to teach and have instead been taught, and she did not know quite what to do with her printed packet. She left it on the porch rail. Elspeth eventually used it to level a short table leg. Martin came in July as promised. He walked the fence line with her on a cool morning, hands in his pockets, watching the geese work Section 3, which was the heaviest cattail ground. The birds had been through Sections 1 and 2 already, which were resting, and the difference was already visible to anyone who knew to look for it. The grazed and rested sections had a lower, finer vegetation emerging among the recovering root systems, the kind of fine-leafed cover that Arvid's notes had predicted would begin to appear in the first season. Martin looked at it and said, "How much did the birds cost?" she told him. He nodded slowly. "And the fencing?" she told him. Another nod. "And you think this is going to produce what exactly?" "Pasture, out of a marsh," she said. "Not this year." He looked at the geese for a while. Then he said very carefully, as though he were selecting each word for its softness, "Mom, I just want to make sure you're not putting a lot of resources into something because it gives you a project." She understood he was not asking about geese. She said, "I am not doing this because I need a project. I am doing this because the notes describe a working system that was proven on this ground across 2 decades, and I have no reason to believe the ground has changed its fundamental nature." Martin had no answer to that. He went back to the city on Sunday afternoon. It was Petra from the Extension Office who became, over that first autumn, something more useful than a visitor. She came back 3 times on her own initiative, without packets and without programs, and she brought on her 3rd visit a colleague from the State Land-Grant University, a soil scientist named Browning, who said very little, but who knelt in Sections 1 and 2 with a probe and a sample jar for 90 minutes, and then stood up and told Elspeth, with the careful hedging of a scientist who does not wish to overstate but cannot suppress the note of real interest in his voice, that the root mat density in the rested sections was measurably different from the control area of ungrazed marsh, and that if this pattern continued, it would be worth documenting formally. He asked if he could come back in spring and take additional samples. She said he could. He became, in the way of quiet, useful people, a regular presence. He brought his graduate student, a serious young man from overseas who never spoke much but who took notes in the same plain way that Arvid had taken notes, dated, without editorializing. Elspeth approved of him. The winter was hard but not catastrophic. She lost 7 birds to a predator she never identified, replaced them in February, and began the 2nd-year rotation in early April, with the flock now wintered and strong, and, she noted, considerably more efficient in their grazing than they had been at the start. Arvid's notes had observed this too. He wrote, "By the 2nd year, the birds know the work. They are not exploring. They are processing. The distinction matters. She read that passage again in February by the kitchen lamp and thought it was the truest description of competence she had ever read in any form. She had expanded the flock by the second spring to 160 birds, having sold the excess from the first breeding season to 2 buyers, one a farm to the west and one a hobby poultry keeper whose enthusiasm exceeded her experience but whose check was sound. The money from the sales offset almost exactly the cost of the additional fencing and the second shelter. She was not yet making money from the Marsh project. She was not losing money either, which is a different thing and a more important one. The operation was self-sustaining before it was profitable, and self-sustaining before profitable was, as Wren had understood, and as she was only now fully grasping, the only sequence that does not eventually break you. In the 3rd year, a man named Vachon came to look at the land. He was not from the county. He was from a regional agricultural investment partnership, the kind of organization that speaks of land the way that a metallurgist speaks of ore, in terms of what can be extracted and at what efficiency. He had heard, through Milo Satterley, or through the County Drainage Authority's records, or through some other channel she never traced, that Plot 7-Marsh might be in play. He came in a clean truck and wore clean boots and stood at the edge of Section 5, which the Geese had not yet reached, and looked at it with professional confidence. He said the drainage conversion costs had come down with new tile technology and that his organization had financing available at favorable terms. He said, "Mrs. Vore, I understand you've been working this parcel with some kind of alternative approach, and I respect the effort, I truly do. But the math on waterfowl pasture conversion against modern tile drainage is not going to come out in the bird's favor." He had a spreadsheet. He showed it to her on a tablet, tilting the screen so she could see. She looked at it. She said, "Your model doesn't include time." He said, "I'm sorry." She said, "Your costs and returns are calculated without accounting for the compounding value of the root mat that is already forming in the 5 rested sections, which is not a theoretical projection, it is a measurable existing condition. Browning from the State University has the core samples." He looked at her for a moment. Then he smiled the particular smile of a man who believes a woman has just surprised him with a word he did not expect her to know. He thanked her for her time and left. She watched the truck go and then went back to checking the fence. She moved the birds through Section 6 that autumn. The visible change in the rested sections by year 3 was no longer subtle. Browning had published a preliminary research note, dry in its language and cautious in its conclusions, as all research notes must be. But the language, read carefully, said something plain. The method was working faster than the literature predicted it should. The root mat in sections 1 and 2 was dense enough by the 3rd autumn that Elspeth had walked across them in ordinary boots in September after 2 weeks of moderate rain, and the ground had held. She stood there for a long time. She thought of Arvid's line, "A marsh is not a problem. It is a process." She did not say anything aloud. There was no one there to say it to, which was fine. The work did not require an audience. The county received notice in the late winter of year 4 of a drought emergency designation for the broader agricultural region. It was not a surprise to anyone who had been reading the climate pattern for the previous 18 months, but the official designation triggered a cascade of consequences that many people had not prepared for, partly because the language of drought emergency sounds like a weather event and not a structural failure, and partly because it is human nature to believe that your system, specifically your system, will be the exception. The groundwater drawdown projections in the emergency designation were severe. The county's row crop ground, heavily tiled, heavily drained of its natural water-holding capacity over decades of drainage improvement, was projected to lose productive capacity at a rate that the designation called significant, and that the Extension Office's bulletin translated into plain numbers that were not good. The tile-drained ground that Vachon's organization had described as optimally efficient was optimally efficient at removing water, which is an excellent quality in a wet year and a catastrophic one in a dry one. The tile didn't care which year it was. It removed water the way it had been engineered to remove it, and in the fourth summer of Elspeth's work on the marsh, there was no water to spare. Elspeth had read the groundwater projections in the Extension Office bulletin that Petra sent her in April and had understood them before anyone told her to. She spent the weeks before the drought peak moving the flock through the final section, completing the rotation, and then she did something that Arvid's notes had described as the system's final step, which he called closing the circuit. She pulled the dividing fences and let the birds range across the full 40 acres under light management, observing where they chose to congregate, where they returned to on their own, using the birds' preference as a final survey of the land's condition. They ranged widely, and they returned always to sections 1 and 2 and the areas between 3 and 4, which told her what the soil probes had already told her, but told her in a different language, the older language, the one that did not require a laboratory. She noted it in her book. Then she moved the shelters to the high edge and checked the water. The drought arrived in June and ran through September. It was not a drought that made headlines in the national press. It was a regional event, a long, grinding, below-average rainfall summer with temperatures that stayed high enough and long enough to matter to anything that depended on moisture. The Satterley ground to the north went brown in August. 3 farms to the south of Elspeth's property applied for emergency operating loans before the end of July, a fact she learned from the county paper, which she read carefully. Milo Satterley's corn, which had looked strong in June, was running 30% below yield projection by the first week of August. He drove past her lane 3 times that summer without stopping, and she noticed this not because she was watching for it, but because she walked the lane every morning, and she noticed most things. Chester Haig drove out in August. He had lost some of his ease. He was still pleasant, still warm. But there was something underneath it now, a careful quality, as if his certainty were crockery that needed to be carried more gently than he had previously realized. He stood at the edge of Section 1 and looked at the grass, which was not green exactly, not the lush green of a well-watered lawn, but was alive, which in August of that year was not nothing. It was more than not nothing. The root mat, now 4 years deep in sections 1 and 2 and 3 years deep in the others, had changed the relationship of that ground to moisture in a way that the tile drainage of the surrounding farms had not. The reformed plant structure, the increased organic matter in the upper soil horizon, the reduction of standing water that had been replaced by a stable, moisture-retaining root architecture, had given those 40 acres a resilience that was not visible until the thing that tested resilience arrived. Chester looked at the grass. He looked at the geese, 162 of them by that count, moving in their slow, patient circuit. He said, well. Then he said, how much water is still in the low sections? She said, enough. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and it cost him something to say it. She could see that it cost him. You had a system here. She said, someone had a system here. I read it. He nodded slowly. He did not say anything else for a while, and she did not fill the silence, because silence had never frightened her, and because she had found over 4 years that the space left by a patient person is almost always filled by the truth eventually. He said, I think I steered you wrong. She said, you told me what you knew. He said, I told you what I believed, which wasn't quite the same thing. She said, no, it wasn't. She said it without heat, as a plain statement of fact. Then she said, do you want to see the root samples? He said yes. They walked sections 1 through 4 while she explained, in the same plain language that Arvid had used, and that she had come to prefer, what had happened in the ground over 4 years. Not a conversion. A process working with the system of the marsh rather than against it, using the natural behavior of the birds, the natural regenerative capacity of the root plants, the natural movement of the water table. Browning's core samples showed the change in measurable terms. The permeability of the upper soil layer had improved such that the ground could receive and retain moisture at a rate that the surrounding tile-drained farms could not approach. In a wet year, the difference was neutral. In a dry year, it was the difference between brown in August and alive in August. Chester listened to all of it with the careful attention of a man who is revising a large interior document and knows it will take time to finish. He did not offer her programs or resources. He asked questions. That was better. He came back the following week with Milo Satterley, who came because Chester asked him to, and because his August corn yield was bad enough to make him willing to look at something he would previously have walked away from. Milo stood in section 2 and pulled a handful of the plant matter up by the root and looked at it for a long time. He did not say anything clever. He said, "How long?" She said, 8 years to be fully stabilized, maybe less, given what's already established. He said, "What do you need to start?" She said, "Geese, time, and patience mostly." He made a short sound that was not quite a laugh, but was something adjacent to it, a sound of recognition. He said, "I got the time." She said, "The patience is harder." He said, "I got that too. I just never needed it before." By the following spring, she had helped establish the same rotational system on 12 additional acres of Milo Satterley's marginal ground. She charged him nothing for the knowledge. She sold him 15 geese from her own flock at what she described as cost, which was below the going price by an amount she calculated privately and did not discuss. Browning's full research paper was published that autumn in a soil science journal, the kind of journal that is not read widely, but is read by the people who make the decisions that later seem, to everyone else, to appear from nowhere. The paper acknowledged Arvid Vor's historical record as the generative source of the method. He was dead, so he could not read it. Elspeth read it twice and then filed it with his 7 pages in the envelope marked Geese. Petra brought 3 different county agents out the following autumn. Chester Haig sent a note, not a form letter, a handwritten note, acknowledging that his earlier assessment had been based on the tile drainage economics of the time and that the time had changed, which he knew was not an adequate accounting, but was the most he could offer. She kept the note. She was not sure why. She thought Wren might have found it interesting. In the year that Elspeth turned 63, she held the first of what became an annual gathering on the farm, open to any neighboring landowner who wanted to walk the marsh with her and see what the 7 pages had instructed and what 4 years of patient, daily, unnewsworthy work had made from a piece of ground the county had formally designated as useless nuisance property. She did not call it a workshop or a seminar or an educational event. She called it a walk. You came, you walked, she talked while she walked, and you could ask questions or you could simply see. Most people simply saw. The seeing was usually enough. The ground spoke, if you were quiet enough to hear it, in the plain language of things that are alive and stable and hold weight and do not give way underfoot, which is a language that any farmer understands in the body if not always in the mind. The graduate student, whose name was Osei, and who had been quiet and careful and diligent through 3 seasons of sample taking, eventually wrote his dissertation on the method. He sent her a copy in the mail. She read the parts that were in plain enough language to follow and skipped the rest without apology. The parts she could read confirmed what she already knew. She wrote him a short letter in return. She thanked him. She told him that the most important line in his entire document was on page 4, where he had written, in the dry, careful language of science, that nevertheless managed to say the true thing. The primary input in all cases was time managed deliberately rather than time passed indifferently. She thought Arvid would have agreed with that. She thought Wren would have too if he had been given more of it. She thought about time a good deal in those years, not with grief exactly, but with a kind of respect for it, the same respect she had for the marsh, which had been called a problem and a nuisance and a waste, and had been none of those things, had only been a process that no one had bothered to learn to read until a woman with a yellow legal pad and 7 pages of her grandfather-in-law's careful observations had sat down one winter evening and begun to read. The 40 acres is on county agricultural maps now under a different designation. It is not marsh, and it is not tiled cropland, and it is not waste. The designation they settled on was improved managed wetland pasture, which is a compromise between the language of what it had been and the language of what it had become, And like most compromises, it is not quite accurate but is the closest the available vocabulary can approach. Elspeth thought it was close enough. She continued to walk it every morning in season, still carrying the small notebook, still writing down what she saw in the plain dated style, still counting the birds. 162 was the count she trusted. She had held it near that number for years. There is a plain wooden sign at the entrance to the marsh path now, put there by the county extension office after some deliberation and with her permission. The sign does not explain the method or quote the research paper or list the drought resilience statistics that Browning's expanded study eventually documented. It says only what she told them to put on it, which is what Arvid's 7 pages had taught her, which is what her grandmother's voice had pressed into her like a coin in a child's palm 40 years before she understood the weight of it. Still, water teaches patience, and patience teaches everything else. She had not needed to invent a saying. The land already had one. She had only needed to be quiet enough and steady enough and willing enough to do the work to hear it.